A world divided, seeds of the Cold War. The year is 1945. World War II, the deadliest conflict in human history, has ended. Victorious but weary, the Allied nations, the United States, Great Britain and the Soviet Union, turn their attention to rebuilding a shattered world. Yet, beneath the surface of this shared goal, a deep mistrust festers. The United States, a champion of capitalist democracy, and the Soviet Union, a communist state under Joseph Stalin, had become uneasy allies during the war. As the war ended, these differences resurfaced with a vengeance, setting the stage for a new kind of conflict, the Cold War. The Iron Curtain falls, capitalism versus communism. This was a defining moment in the 20th century, marking the beginning of a prolonged period of geopolitical tension. At the heart of the Cold War lay a fundamental clash of ideologies, capitalism versus communism. This ideological battle influenced global politics, economics, and even culture for decades. The United States, with its emphasis on individual liberty, prided itself on being the land of the free. The American dream promised prosperity and success through hard work and innovation. Free markets and democratic governance stood as the champion of the capitalist world. Wall Street symbolized economic power, while democratic elections showcased political freedom. On the other side stood the Soviet Union, a nation built on the principles of Marxist-Leninist ideology. The state controlled the means of production, aiming to create a classless society, a totalitarian state where the Communist Party controlled all aspects of life. Propaganda was a powerful tool used to maintain control and promote the communist ideology. The Soviets, led by Joseph Stalin, sought to export their communist revolution, believing it was their duty to spread communism worldwide. Viewing the United States and its allies as existential threats, the Soviet Union fortified its borders and expanded its influence in Eastern Europe. Europe found itself carved in two, the capitalist West and the communist East. Families and friends were separated, and a stark contrast in lifestyles emerged. Separated by what Winston Churchill famously dubbed the Iron Curtain, this division symbolized the broader conflict between two opposing worldviews. The Iron Curtain was not just a physical barrier, but also a metaphor for the ideological divide that defined the era. Flashpoint, Berlin, blockade, and airlift. Nowhere was the division between East and West more palpable than in Berlin. In 1948, tensions over Berlin erupted into crisis. The Soviets decided to cut off all land access to West Berlin, initiating the Berlin blockade. The United States and its allies responded with the Berlin airlift, a daring and unprecedented operation. For over a year, cargo planes carried tons of supplies to the beleaguered city. The blockade was eventually lifted, but the crisis cemented Berlin's status as a Cold War flashpoint. Brink of annihilation, the Cuban Missile Crisis. The Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962 brought the world to the brink of nuclear war. The crisis was sparked by the Soviet Union's decision to place nuclear missiles on the island of Cuba, just 90 miles off the coast of Florida. President John F. Kennedy imposed a naval blockade on Cuba, demanding the removal of the missiles. For 13 agonizing days, the world held its breath as the two superpowers stared each other down. In the end, diplomacy prevailed, and the Soviets agreed to remove the missiles from Cuba. Reaching for the stars, the space race. The Cold War rivalry extended beyond Earth, reaching into space. The space race was more than just a competition to achieve technological superiority. It was a battle for prestige. The Soviets struck the first blow in 1957 with the launch of Sputnik, the world's first artificial satellite. The United States responded with the Apollo program, an ambitious endeavor to land a man on the moon. In 1969, American astronaut Neil Armstrong took one small step onto the lunar surface, fulfilling President John F. Kennedy's bold challenge. The space race had an undeniable impact on human history, pushing the boundaries of science and technology. Proxy wars and shifting sands, Vietnam and Afghanistan. These two conflicts, though separated by time and geography, share striking similarities in their impact and the lessons they offer. The Cold War was fought through proxy wars, regional conflicts fueled by superpower rivalry. These wars were battlegrounds where the ideologies of the United States and the Soviet Union clashed indirectly. Two of the most significant proxy wars were the Vietnam War and the Soviet-Afghan War. Both conflicts drew in major powers and had far-reaching consequences for the countries involved and the world at large. The Vietnam War pitted the communist North Vietnamese, supported by the Soviet Union and China, against the US-backed South Vietnamese government. This war was not just a battle for territory, but a struggle for ideological dominance. The war became deeply unpopular in the United States, fueling anti-war protests and dividing the nation. The images of the conflict broadcasted into American homes played a significant role in shaping public opinion. The US withdrawal from Vietnam in 1973 was seen as a major setback for the West. It marked the first time the United States had failed to achieve its objectives in a major conflict, leading to a period of introspection and re-evaluation of foreign policy. Decades later, the Soviet Union found itself bogged down in Afghanistan, facing fierce resistance from Afghan Mujahideen fighters. This conflict mirrored the Vietnam War in many ways, with the Soviet Union playing the role of the superpower unable to secure a decisive victory. The Soviet-Afghan War drained Moscow's resources and further exposed the weaknesses of the Soviet system. The prolonged conflict contributed to the eventual dissolution of the Soviet Union, highlighting the limits of military power in achieving political goals. Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall. By the early 1980s, the Soviet Union began to show signs of strain. The Soviet economy stagnated under inefficient central planning and a bloated military-industrial complex. In 1985, Mikhail Gorbachev emerged as a reformer, introducing perestroika, restructuring, and glasnost, openness. Gorbachev's reforms, while intended to save the Soviet system, ultimately hastened its demise. Popular movements for change swept across Eastern Europe. In 1989, the Berlin Wall crumbled under the weight of popular protest. One by one, communist regimes across Eastern Europe collapsed, marking the beginning of the end of the Cold War. The nuclear threat, a perilous game. Throughout the Cold War, the spectre of nuclear annihilation loomed large. Both the United States and the Soviet Union amassed vast arsenals of nuclear weapons. The development of increasingly powerful nuclear weapons fueled a dangerous arms race. Despite the ever-present danger, there were moments of hope. Arms control talks, like the Limited Test Ban Treaty and the Strategic Arms Limitation talks, offered glimpses of a path towards a less perilous future. A new world order, the collapse of the Soviet Union. With the fall of the Berlin Wall and the collapse of communism in Eastern Europe, the Soviet Union began to unravel. Nationalist movements within the Soviet Republic surged, demanding greater autonomy. In August 1991, a coup attempt by hardline communists failed, further weakening Gorbachev's authority. On December 25, 1991, the Soviet flag flew over the Kremlin for the last time. The Cold War, which had cast a long shadow over the 20th century, was finally over. The legacy of the Cold War. The Cold War may be over, but its legacy continues to shape the world today. The ideological battle between the East and the West, capitalism and communism, has left an indelible mark on international relations and domestic policies across the globe. The collapse of the Soviet Union led to the emergence of a new world order, with the United States as the sole superpower. This shift in power dynamics brought about significant changes in global politics, economics, and military strategies. New challenges and threats emerged, from ethnic conflicts to the rise of terrorism. The power vacuum left by the Soviet Union's dissolution created opportunities for regional conflicts and the spread of extremist ideologies. The Cold War also left behind environmental consequences from decades of industrial and military activity. Abandoned military sites, nuclear test zones, and industrial pollution are stark reminders of the era's environmental toll. Yet the end of the Cold War ushered in an era of unprecedented global interconnectedness. The rise of the Internet, international trade agreements, and the strengthening of global institutions like the United Nations have fostered a more interconnected world. The lessons learned, the importance of diplomacy, the necessity of dialogue, and the value of peaceful negotiations have become cornerstones of modern international relations. The dangers of ideological extremism, which can lead to division, conflict, and even war, are ever-present reminders of the past. The need for global cooperation remain relevant in our increasingly complex world. As nations navigate the challenges of the 21st century, The legacy of the Cold War serves as both a cautionary tale and a guide for building a more peaceful and cooperative global community.